Last time we spoke about the fall of Tikhvin. The German offensive towards Tikhvin stalled against Rasputitsa, ice and supply failures, while Soviet resilience around Leningrad, Volkov and Moscow's approaches slowed the Germans' advance. From November the 9th to the 15th of 1941, Hitler's high command grappled with harsh logistical realities. Trains, fuel, and winter clothing were scarce. Many units lacked adequate armor and reconnaissance. Stalin reshuffled commanders, appointing Meretskov to command the Fourth Army, and he cancelled some attacks due to weak force of strength, while pressing others to continue offensives despite dire conditions. At the front, the 4th, 52nd, and 54th Armies attempted to blunt the German thrusts and seize critical corridors, but frontal assaults amidst the brutal cold yielded limited gains and heavy casualties. The Schleswig corridor, Lake Loka and Volkov remained focal points as both sides jockeyed for position and supply routes. Across Kharkiv, Sevastopol, and Crimea, German advances stalled or receded amidst fierce Soviet defense and attritional warfare. Overall, winter intensified the struggle, highlighting endurance and the limits of operational planning under extreme conditions. This episode is The Battle of Moscow Starts. Hello again and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and you can also use this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And please don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I just released a 6.5-hour episode covering the Japanese invasion of the Philippines during World War II. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will be tackling next. Even in their depleted state, the Wehrmacht's officers pressed for a major winter offensive against Moscow and Rostov. And as winter tightened its grip over the USSR, Hitler's panzers rolled forward again. Kleist pushed towards Rostov, while Army Group Center's panzers began the battle for Moscow, and the Red Army responded by stepping up its counteroffensive against Leib's overstretched forces. Now last week, Klykov's 52nd Army launched an offensive that failed to achieve its aims. Stavka pressed him to attack again, but the army needed time to reorganize, until about the 17th of November, when the night brought a sharper tactic. Two detachments from the 259th and 111th Rifle Divisions slipped behind German lines, and in the morning those two divisions struck Malaya Vishera. The defenders were outflanked and overwhelmed, creating a breach in the German 126th Division's line, which was forced to retreat west towards Bolshaya Vishera and the Volkhov River. Yet Klykov's pursuit slowed, because the 215th Division was hurried into the line to reinforce the 126th after its redeployment from France. Despite this progress, Leib managed to reinforce the besieged 39th Panzer Corps at Tikhvin with the 61st Infantry Division, a move made necessary as the German Fourth Army opened its offensive on the 19th. Deep snow slowed the Northern Shock Group as it pressed towards Tikhvin, crawling through heavy resistance, while the Eastern Shock Group stalled at the Tivinka River and along the Tikhvin-Talsi Road, clashing with the 20th Motorized and 61st Infantry Divisions. Meanwhile, the Southern Shock Group targeted the supply routes to Tikhvin, making steady progress against the layered battle groups defending the extended southern flank of the Panzer Corps. Although the Soviet attack had stalled, the German positions around Tikhvin remained under constant pressure, with the 8th Panzer Force even breaching its line on November the 20th. These clashes set the stage for a brutal winter campaign across multiple axes, as the push towards Moscow and Rostov competed with tense defensive holds around Tikhvin, and both sides stretched their resources to the limit. Trapped in a three-sided vise and poorly supplied, the 39th Panzer Corps took heavy losses from the fierce fighting and the cold. Leib still believed Tikhvin could be held, but concluded he would need 2 more infantry divisions to help shield the line from Ostashkov to Lake Viel and the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. He thus sought ways to crush the forces west of the Volkhov River, hoping to free up 5 more divisions. However, rumors reached him that the 39th Mobile Corps might be withdrawn from Army Group North. On the 20th, he informed the OKH that he would need 4 or 5 fresh divisions to replace the Mobile Corps, and if he could obtain permission to abandon Tikhvin, that requirement might be reduced by just 1. Everyone knew that achieving such a transfer was completely impossible, so talk of withdrawing the corps ceased. Yet Halde insisted that Tikhvin be held at all cost. Any hope for a link-up with the Finns now rested on the Finns launching their own offensive, but they remained fully employed in East Karelia. Kondopogo had fallen, with both offensive prongs meeting north at Lake Laisma. Since then, extreme cold and snow had slowed the Army of Karelia to a crawl. Leib's problems could have been worse, but the 54th Army was still not in a position to launch its own offensive. It remained preoccupied with the latest push from the reinforced group Bokman. On the 18th, Leib detached a battle group from the 12th Panzers to bolster their drive towards Lake Ladoga. Random fact, this is the same day Operation Crusader would start in North Africa, with British forces surprising Rommel and his Italian allies. Overall, the North Africa campaign deeply affected the Eastern Front as Germany had to divert more and more of its forces to remedy one of Italy's numerous, well, let's just say it, fuck-ups. And if you want to learn more about that, please head on over to Echoes of War, where we have a 10-part series covering the entire North Africa campaign. Heavy fighting also raged outside the Volkhov and Voipokala stations, even as the German advance began to slow despite additional reinforcements. Meanwhile, assaults from Leningrad and operations by the 8th Army continued all week with little to show for them, the repeated efforts yielding the same lack of success. The persistent failures prompted the Stavka to replace Sheveldin, with Bondarev as commander of the 8th Army, and Lazarov was replaced by Shvirodov as the commander of the 55th Army. Despite the heavy losses, the Stavka insisted that the attacks go on, aiming to keep the German divisions tied down around Leningrad and thereby prevent them from aiding the forces at Tikhvin and the Volkhov. With the ice of Lake Ladoga hindering boat movements, but not yet thick enough to support vehicles, an emergency air bridge was established to sustain Leningrad. However, between the 14th and 28th of November, only about 1,200 tons of high-calorie food could be flown in, far short of the city's needs. Food was growing scarce, and rationing tightened even further. From November the 20th, workers in priority jobs received only 375 grams of bread per day, while dependents were reduced to 125 grams. This was down from an initial ration of 250 grams a day, or 300 for children under 12. The soldiers in Leningrad had access to just 500 grams of bread daily, yet the city required about 510 tons of bread each day to meet the demands. To stretch supplies, edible cellulose was added to the bread mixture, along with other additives such as malt, soybeans, and oatmeal. The percentage of cellulose ranged from about 20 to 50% of the bread, while the additives could make up 40% of the bread. And even with measures like this, the city still needed more than 1,000 tons of supplies a day to sustain everybody, which could not be transported properly. And a famine began in November, followed by disease as the city's health system strained to cope. Roughly 10,000 people died in the city during November, a figure that would rapidly rise as shortages deepened. In an effort to counter this, on the 19th, the Leningrad front ordered the construction of a military vehicle road between Gabona and Vaganova across the frozen lake of Lake Ladoga. However, the railway link between Gabonya and Volga ran through the besieged Volkhov and the occupied Tikhvin. So until Tikhvin could be reclaimed, a second road was forged to bypass the German forces. Light horse carts had already begun crossing the Strzelberg Bay from the 19th, though the 100mm thick ice was not yet sufficient to support even supply trucks. This situation would change by the 22nd when the first major vehicle column, carrying about 33 tons of flour, crossed the ice amidst a heavy snowstorm. Thus began the road to life, as it would be called. Gone were the Rasputitsa thaws and freezes around Moscow. The weather had settled into a regime of permanent snow and ice. With hopes of restored mobility, Operation Typhoon resumed on the 15th of November. In previous seasons, the Red Army clung stubbornly to every meter of ground. But this time, the 27th Corps' opening offensive met only thinly dispersed screening troops, as the main Soviet forces had already withdrawn behind the Volga, and all the bridges across the river had been blown up before the 27th Corps could even reach them. On the 16th, the 16th Army committed the 126th Rifle, the 17th and 24th Cavalry, and the 58th Tank Divisions to an offensive at the boundary between the 27th Army and the 56th Panzer Corps. The attack pressed against the 7th Panzer and the 14th Motorized earlier that day, but bogged down after about 4 kilometers, suffering heavy losses. In an attempt to exploit the minor opening between the 56th Panzer and the 27th Army Corps, the 20th and 44th Cavalry Divisions were set in next. This proved a poor decision, as they charged straight into waiting German infantry across an open field, yielding predictable results. The 56th Panzer Corps would counterattack, aiming to push the boundary between the Soviet 30th and 16th Armies. The 7th Panzers made very little progress, but its accompanying 14th Motorized Division managed to cross the Lama River at Gribanovo and Kuzowa. The earlier losses meant Roskossovsky could not hold the Lama River line and was compelled to retreat to new defenses on the 17th, with not all of his forward formations able to escape the faster-moving German units, resulting in further losses. The Soviet 49th Army had launched spoiling attacks against the right flank of the 4th Army, gaining little ground but forcing Klug to adopt extreme caution. At the same time, the 49th Army, together with the 50th Army, remained engaged in a running battle against Guderian's forces around Tula, though their casualties were not immediately exploited. There had been more planned attacks against the German forces, one of which had diverted some reserves away from the 30th and 16th Armies to assemble a force around Volokolamsk for an assault against Kalinin. On Kluge's left flank, the 2nd Panzer Division would open their own offensive up on the 16th as well, aiming to secure better positions for the 5th Army Corps. The clash with the 316th Rifle Division for this attack would give rise to a legend intended to boost morale. To be more specific, the Soviets later promoted a myth, Panfilov's 28ers, portraying 28 heroes who supposedly sacrificed themselves to destroy a dozen tanks as a propaganda boost. A declassified Soviet report later revealed that the story had been completely fabricated. The Commissar's rallying cry in the propaganda posters would read, "Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. We have our backs to Moscow." This became immortalized. Such appeals to patriotism helped sustain the Red Army's morale alongside its iron discipline. These offensives effectively split the 16th Army from the 30th Army as well. The Volga north of the Volga Reservoir was used to anchor a flank of the 30th Army's defenses, while elements of the 9th Army pursued, in order to secure bridgeheads across the river and protect the flank of the Moscow Drive. The 16th Army anchored its northern approach to Moscow at Klin. The divergent aims of the 3rd Panzer Group and the 9th Army would lead to the Panzer Group being shifted to direct command of Army Group Center by the 19th. Historians David Stahel and David Glantz both note that the Western Front had about 240,000 men, 1,254 guns, 502 tanks, and between 600 to 700 aircraft to oppose the renewed offensive, including Kalinin's front and the 30th Army. On the 17th, this army was transferred to the Western Front, a move driven by logic. It was now assigned to protect Zhukov's flank from the upcoming offensive rather than participating in the Kalinin assaults. Moreover, out of the 502 tanks available, only 200 were T-34s or KP-1 models, underscoring the material constraints that shaped the fighting. Although numerically weaker than the forces arrayed against them, this tally does not include the 68,000-strong Moscow garrison, or any of the Stavka reserves waiting behind the lines. Glantz estimated Bok's army group at roughly 233,000 men, 1,880 guns, 1,300 tanks, and about 600 aircraft. Zetterling, another historian, provides separate figures for November, the 2nd Army at about 124,520 men, the 4th Army at 287,732 men, the 9th Army at 213,608,000, the 2nd Panzer Army at 182,321 men, the 3rd Panzer Group at 91,726 men, and the 4th Panzers at about 249,294. It is important to note that not all of these forces were necessarily facing the Western Front at the same time, however. In addition, some sources claim that the Western Front held around 700 tanks and just under 1,200 aircraft. As with many wartime statistics, these numbers vary by source and methodology, which can be, frustrating for us researchers. Zhukov's forces were deeply entrenched, with bunker after bunker protecting the positions. Vast minefields also shielded Soviet lines and constrained German tanks, while roads were clogged with mines and fallen trees. The Ninth Corps had to be fought over, and dealing with these obstacles required extensive infantry work, a demand that the panzer groups, now heavy with tanks, could not meet without infantry support. This gap forced the Panzer Group 3 to urgently request infantry reinforcements on the 17th. On the 17th, Kluge, still in command of the Panzer Group, delayed the 4th Panzer Group's main offensive to the 18th, allowing 2 regiments from the 5th Army Corps to attack in order to maintain contact with the flank of the advancing 9th Army. As Kluge recalled, "As far as the number of the divisions in relation to the width of the front is concerned, the 4th Army is better off than all the other armies of the Army Group. In spite of the extraordinary drop in strength, on the whole, the state of its forces is in no way worse than that of the other fronts." Kluge further justified the delay by citing the need to counter constant Soviet offensives against the 7th and 20th Army Corps in the south. Bach responded with a blistering critique, arguing that Kluge's inaction endangered the 9th Army, and pointed out that delaying due to the lack of action from the weaker 2nd Panzer Army was hypocritical. Kluge then claimed the entire 4th Army would attack on the 18th, but 15 minutes later a new message stated that only the 5th Army Corps and portions of the 46th Panzer Corps would actually initiate the assault, with the remainder of the Army and the Panzer Group held back for a delay until the 19th. Bach pressed Halde to pressure Kluge into a full commitment to the attack, yet stopped short of asking Halde to order it outright. Bach admitted to Halde that Kluge's right wing was struggling and likely needed reinforcements to shore them up. The 4th Army's war diary reflected this, with one infantry regiment down to 400 effectives, and many divisions were at the limit of their endurance. Halde countered, insisting that regardless of how dire the situation looked for any German formation, it would be far worse for the Soviets opposing them. "We must understand that things are going much worse for the enemy than for us, and that these battles are less of a question of strategic command than a question of energy." The 5th Army Corps had been reinforced with the 2nd Panzer Division and 2 additional infantry divisions, and they attacked on the 18th to bolster the struggling Panzer Group 3. The infantry's arrival broke through the Soviet defenses, and Belgorod fell, with about 1,550 taken prisoner. Tank losses were quite heavy on both sides, but considerably worse for the Soviets. German tankers once again complained about their inability to damage the Soviet T-34 or the KV-1 tanks, noting that unless they scored a lucky hit on a critical point, the rounds simply bounced off. A German tanker's diary on the 20th, after closing to point-blank range against a crippled KV-1, had this to say: "We fired 30 shots into him. Nothing got through. There weren't 10 centimeter without a direct hit. We'd never experienced anything like it." The infantry divisions likewise pressed for immediate deployment of a 75mm anti-tank gun, as they faced challenges even greater than the panzers. Both formations grew increasingly dependent on the cumbersome Flak 88s to counter the modern Soviet armor, a vulnerability intensified by the winter conditions that limited mobility and undermined their former tactical approach. The 41st Panzer Corps at Kanin was ordered to attack despite having no fuel to move and no expected supply until the 24th or the 28th. This was a constraint that loomed as a critical bottleneck. Supply shortages threatened to halt the advance of the formations already in motion, with fuel deficits reported across all the panzer and motorized formations. Supply shortages also hampered Luftwaffe operations before the full impact of cold and weather actually set in. On many days, they could not even mount a single sortie. One Stuka wing managed only a single mission on the 13th and the 18th, and 4 on the 26th and the 28th, with no flights on the remaining days in November. Between November the 15th and December the 5th, Soviet sources claimed the Luftwaffe in front of Moscow managed about 3,500 sorties, while the VVS flew roughly 15,840 times. German sources themselves lament the onslaught of Soviet air attacks and an apparent sobering absence of their own air power. On the 19th, Hopno believed the Soviet 16th Army was in flight and pressed for relentless pursuits from all the formations, brushing aside Kluge's reservations. Many of Hopno's divisions had to push motorized infantry forward on foot, and fuel shortages prevented all tanks from advancing. which kind of makes a mockery of the frantic efforts of the previous weeks to restore the panzer numbers at the expense of just about everything else. They lacked the fuel to use just over half of their tanks, with the 20th Division only able to send 49 of their 75 tanks into the battle. This conviction clashed with numerous reports and diary entries detailing heavy resistance on the front. There were also several local reserves, with captured Germans subjected to massacres in some of the counterattacks. Hearing of one such incident, Hopna urged that no prisoners be taken and that mercy be dispensed to the Soviet soldiers. Rokossovsky, now under extreme pressure, begged for permission to withdraw to the Isla River. His army was depleted of reserves as the panzer groups were closing in, threatening to encircle him. Zhukov rejected the retreat, but Rokossovsky pressed on, appealing to Marshal Shapnoshnikov, who assented. A crisis hit when Shapnoshnikov, unaware that Zhukov had already forbidden the retreat, seemed to sanction a withdrawal. Zhukov exploded with fury at this bypass of his authority. "I am the frontline commander. I countermand the order to withdraw to the Isla Reservoir, and I order you to defend the lines you occupy without retreating a single step." In retaliation, Rokossovsky was ordered to take not a single step back. Unable to withstand the mounting pressure, his front line collapsed on the 20th. In a rather dramatic shift, Hopna's panzers surged forward, advancing 23 kilometers in a single day, after previously averaging only about 5 kilometers a day. By the week's end, they stood a mere 48 kilometers north of Moscow. The specter of encircling the 16th Army buoyed the German generals even as mounting cold began to weigh on their nerves. Nighttime security grew lax as soldiers sought shelter from the shrinking temperatures, and sporadic Red Army raids began to exact greater damage under the cover of darkness. Attacks became increasingly hard to mount, with warm quarters and comfort tempting soldiers to resist the effort to push forward. Many soldiers and junior officers doubted their ability to fight in the heavy snow, expecting to retreat to barracks to endure the winter. They showed little appetite for more fighting in these frozen conditions. Halted dismissed these concerns as the Red Army being worse off, framing the cold as merely a test of will for the average soldier to endure. Meanwhile, box infantry divisions were bleeding manpower, taking position after position and leaving regiments reduced to company strength. To the south, Guderian's offensive began on the 16th with a preliminary strike that captured Bogoroditsk. 2 days later, the main assault launched, targeting Kolomna, a mere 125 kilometers from Tula, though the army could travel only about 80 kilometers due to fuel shortages. In a rather costly relocation, the 3 motorized divisions were stripped of fuel to support the panzer divisions, but even with that, it was not enough to reach Kolomna. This was even with the army's massively reduced panzer numbers. The 3rd Panzers had 60 tanks, the 4th Panzers had 25, 17th Panzers had just 15 operational tanks. The 18th Panzers had 50. The 2nd Panzer Army had started the war with more than 1,000 tanks, but was now only using about 150. Ironically, the same amount that they had received in reinforcement in the build-up to Operation Typhoon. Bach judged that fuel constraints would limit the operation more than the Soviet resistance. The spearhead was to be the 24th Panzer Corps. Instead of punching straight through the entrenched garrison at Tula, the plan called for the 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions to encircle the city from the east. The 17th Panzer Division was ordered to seize Kashelia with 15 tanks in hand. The 18th Panzer Division was tasked with taking Efremov 120 kilometers south of Tula, while the rest of the 47th Panzer Corps moved to take Mikhailov, keeping contact with the 2nd Army. The 53rd Army Corps would maintain liaison between the 2 panzer formations while also capturing Venev. The 43rd Army, positioned between Likhvin and Kaluga, was ordered to march northwest of Tula to meet the encircling 24th Corps and then stay in contact with Kluge's army. With his divisions already stretched quite thin and widely, Guderian admitted doubts about the operation's success even before it began. Guderian did not know that the Bryansk front had been dissolved on the 10th, with its armies redistributed to the western and southwestern fronts. Those fronts repositioned their forces towards their respective bodies, which left a fragile and weakened boundary where Guderian planned to strike. The southwestern front additionally lacked sufficient staff officers to effectively command all of its armies. Proposals to create an independent Orlov front to shore up this weakness lingered far too long without any decision being made. It was precisely this vulnerability that Guderian aimed to exploit. In the brutal -18-degree weather, Guderian's offensive began at a crawl. Many Germans had started to use propaganda leaflets and newspapers in an attempt to improve the insulation of their uniforms. By the 19th, the 4th Panzer Division reported it did not have enough strength required to fulfill its directives. On the 20th, all 3 Panzer Divisions suffered a massive drop in fighting capability due to the bitter cold and fuel shortages. Meanwhile, the 43rd Army Corps had to assume a defensive posture as it came under heavy attack from the 49th Army. Guderian admitted to Bock that his army was far too weak to reach its objectives. Bock demanded confirmation after conveying it to OKH, but the information was simply ignored. This pattern repeated on the 21st, with Guderian pleading to shift to the defensive. And when you have a guy like Guderian talking about shifting to the defensive, things are not going well. Yet the day's events of the 53rd Army's victory at Islovaya and the 4th Panzer's repulsion of a Soviet counterattack launched by 2 Siberian divisions prompted a dramatic reversal in the mood. On the 22nd, Guderian claimed he could reach the Komna to Ryazan railway line, a declaration that severely undermined his credibility with Bock and Halde. In the sideshow offensive, the 18th Panzer Division captured Efremov on the 20th after pushing more than 50 kilometers. From their divisional war diary, under the worst circumstances, the division took the important industrial city of Efremov without a tank, without anti-aircraft guns, without assault guns, without support from our own planes, with only 2 engineer companies. Yet the rapid advance stretched the division quite thin, and the Soviet forces were reported to be massing for a nice counterattack. To the south, Schmidt's Second Army had attempted to seize Voronezh after taking Kursk, but the effort collapsed. The second assault on Voronezh was planned for the 16th, but was postponed to the 18th, and then delayed again to the 20th due to supply shortages. There was a real fear that the army's flank would be exposed if the sluggish 6th Army did not advance. When the 6th Army finally moved, it met little resistance and only made some minor gains. As German troops were forced out of the relative warmth of prepared positions into the cold, their looting of the civilian population intensified. Curtains, towels, tablecloths, and anything that they could get their hands on were stolen to protect them against the elements. Trade with locals was rare. Most often civilians were simply murdered to seize what they needed. Prisoners of war and the dead were stripped of nearly everything, save for their distinctive jackets, because there was a great fear amongst the German soldiers of being misidentified as a Soviet and then getting executed. By the way, this totally happened. In the words of propaganda writer Ilya Ehrenburg, "They are rushing towards Moscow, like frozen men rushing to the fire. They are ready to come under fire for a pair of felt boots or a woman's warm jacket. That's why they are now doubly dangerous. In terror, they say to each other, 'This is only November.'" Kleist renewed his offensive against Rostov on the 17th in negative 22-degree weather. The 3rd Panzer Corps pushed forward and reached Nakhichevan-on-Don on the 19th, just short of Rostov despite relentless assaults by the 9th Army. Instead of assaulting directly through the heavy fortifications on the main route, Akatsin maneuvered north of Rostov to strike from the east. The following day, Rostov fell to the Lebensstandard SS, securing an intact railway bridge and establishing a small bridgehead across the Don River. The overall Rostov operation had cost the Panzer Army around 6,000 casualties and half of its remaining tanks. Yet Rundstedt already wanted to abandon the city, and Kleist contemplated withdrawing to the Meuse. Timoshenko planned a substantial counteroffensive against the extended northern flank of Kleist's 1st Panzer Army. The objective was quite bold: reach Taganrog and, if possible, encircle the 1st Panzer Army. To that end, Rostov would be held by the 56th Army, while the rebuilt 9th and 18th Armies would man the flanks. The 37th Army would spearhead the main effort, reinforced by 4 rifle divisions and 4 armored brigades. The 12th Army would provide support to the 37th, and in total, the Soviet plan enlisted 40 rifle divisions, 13 cavalry divisions, 7 tank brigades, and an airborne corps. This ambitious offensive stretched the Southern Front's command and control to its absolute limits, diminishing its ability to respond quickly to Kleist's drive on Rostov. It's possible the 56th Army's role was more delaying defense than a genuine attempt to stop the Germans, designed to lure Kleist in and anchor him for the Southern Front's own attack. Timoshenko's counteroffensive would begin on the 17th, concurrent with Kleist's assault. The 37th Army's assault struck the flanks of the 17th Army, the Italian CSIR, the 49th Mountain Division, and the left flank of the 14th Panzer Corps. A breach would be opened between the 1st Mountain Division and the SS Viking. The only local reserves available was the brigade-sized Slovakian Mobile Division. Fuel shortages further hampered the Germans' mobile divisions from employing their usual mobile defensive tactics. While Kleist begged Rundstedt for reserves to avert disaster, the OKH insisted with dangerous optimism that Kleist press on immediately to seize Markop and Stalingrad. Interestingly, in his diary, Halder would write on the 21st, "Rostov is in our hands. North of Rostov, 1st Panzer Army was forced into defense by the Russian attack with superior forces, and will have a hard time seeing it through." Yet there was no reserves to spare, and mounting Soviet pressures from the 9th and 56th Armies hampered Rostov, threatening to push out the 3rd Panzer Corps. These attacks managed to force the Lebensstadt SS back across the Don by the 21st, while a second attempt to establish a bridgehead across the Don was absolutely crushed. It's worth noting that the Don had frozen solid, allowing tanks to cross, but its width meant any crossing would have to cover up to about a kilometer in quite exposed ground. With Crimea conquered except for Sevastopol, Manstein's task boiled down to preventing Soviet reinforcements from arriving while continuing the siege of the fortress. His other objectives, opening a route through the Kerch Strait and pushing towards Markop, remained impossible until the 1st Panzer Army had advanced further. As a result, Manstein faced pressure beginning on the 20th to shift divisions to the more urgent sectors. Yet the main events of this phase would unfold the following week and are reserved for coverage then. At Sevastopol, the 22nd Infantry Division had arrived from the north, spurring a renewed assault on the outer defenses. The 4 German divisions pressed the offensive for about 5 days before being halted, having sustained roughly 3,000 casualties for very little to show in close-quarters fighting. Soviet counterattacks to improve their positions also failed. Manstein abandoned his plan to rush into the port and instead adopted a more methodical, deliberate offensive. The near ubiquitous air superiority hindered the German effort in the local area, despite the overall dominance. German air assets could base only a single fighter group and a single Stuka group at Epatoria. The remainder of the 4th Flieger Corps operated far away in Ukraine, tasked with several missions beyond supporting the 11th Army at Sevastopol. On the 20th, Manstein issued an order, grounded in the Reichenau severity doctrine, directing measures that targeted the extermination of Jews. Not surprisingly, this is absent from his memoirs, which also claim that the German troops never looted and had a good relationship with the local Soviet civilians. Jewish Bolshevik systems must be wiped out at once and for all and should never again be allowed to invade our European living space. It is the same Jewish class of beings who have done so much to damage our own fatherland by virtue of their activities against the nation and civilization, and who promote anti-German tendencies throughout the world, and who will be the harbingers of revenge. Their extermination is a dictate of our own survival. Now, while he did not actively collaborate with SS Einsatzgruppe D to carry out the killings across Crimea, he did request their presence, apparently to free up housing for his troops. In non-battlefield matters on the 22nd, Sir Winston Churchill began pressing the governments of Hungary, Romania, and Finland to withdraw from hostilities against USSR. Churchill had feared a war declaration would drive these nations into the German camp permanently, but in the end succumbed to pressure from Stalin for greater support. He set a deadline for December the 5th for the replies. If they did not respond positively, the United Kingdom would have no choice but to declare war on these nations. Churchill also proposed that Antonio Eden traveled to Moscow to confer with Stalin on the post-war settlement, de-emphasizing illogical rifts and ease tensions between all the allies. Stalin accepted this proposal. As convoys continued to arrive in the USSR, German formations reported facing Soviet units equipped with American and British weapons. Several tank duels erupted between German panzers and British-made tanks. The medium-caliber weapons mounted on the Matilda and the Valentine tanks were frequent complaints amongst the Soviet tankers, but despite these flaws, the Western-equipped tanks remained competitive with the majority of German armor, especially given the depletion of Germany's own tank forces. The influx of Allied-supported materiel also contributed to a political challenge in the UK, where war production intended to aid the USSR was popular amongst factory workers and strained labor relations. Lord Hankey, the Paymaster General, complained about Lord Beaverbrook, the Supply Master General. "Now I have to bring to light the fact that he is building nothing but dud tanks, when it is so appealing to the workers to work all day and night to produce for Russia, and all to give them dud tanks. Meanwhile, more squadrons flying Western-design aircraft were being activated around Moscow. An ironic moment occurred when a German bomber, tasked with dropping propaganda leaflets over Moscow, proclaimed that, "Your allies are not helping you." And he was shot down by a Western fighter. This encounter fed anxiety amongst some Germans who encountered Western equipment in Soviet hands, fueling fears that the war might last a lot longer than anticipated. An unidentified German soldier's letter home had this to say: "The war with Russia will last a long time yet. The enemy is offering tremendous resistance, and the fanaticism that lies beyond this obstinacy knows no bounds. To this must be added absolutely inexhaustible reserves of manpower, equipment, the latter being augmented by deliveries from America." On November the 21st, Marshal Spotnikov and the General Staff began planning their response. 22 armies, totaling 58 divisions, remained uncommitted and undetected deep within the interior of the USSR. Some of these formations were newly raised, while others were being transferred from the Far East. Although I have to say this, it is a myth to claim that every one of these divisions was an elite Siberian unit. In reality, Siberian divisions varied. Often they had more training, yes, yet many still adhered to the large pre-war divisions. And if you're a nerd, and you really want to know about this very, very niche story, please go check out my episode. You can go over to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast series for the episode titled, "What if Japan invaded the USSR instead?" There I actually cracked the numbers and I looked into the myth of the Siberian Corps being delivered to save Moscow. Spoiler, it's not as true as you would think. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. If you're looking for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. And if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Hitler's forces pushed towards Rostov and Moscow despite fuel shortages, snow, and deteriorating supply lines. The 4th and 2nd Panzer Groups encountered fierce Soviet defenses, command reshuffles, and mounting casualties. The Red Army held the key corridors, and the Luftwaffe faltered due to the bitter weather as the Soviets established the road to life across Lake Loka.